Welcome to my channel. Today's video was requested by many, and it's about how to make icing or frosting, but not for pastry or for cookies, but for soap. An important tool for piping are of course piping tips, and there are so many variations of it. Here are just a few examples. Each one of those is going to result in a different design. There are also different sizes, as you can see here. We are going to have a look at each individual one of these later on, but on what concerns storage, I like to keep them in a little toolbox so I can easily see what I have at hand and I can store them comfortably. There are different types of piping bags as well, like for example this one is a disposable one, and if you use a disposable one I advise you use a sturdy one. They sound a little bit like this. They usually come in a packet. You can find these practically everywhere, and then you have also the non-disposable ones, as you can see here. I use both of them, it's just a matter of preference. I like to prepare my piping bag beforehand because sometimes when you are soaping things go really fast, and I start by cutting the tip of my piping bag according to the size of my piping tip. I slide in the tip just like so, then I twist it, as you can see here, and I turn the piping tip towards me in my hand, then I pop it into a jug or a container so that I can fill the bag comfortably and I'm sure that the batter will not leak out. I personally use the same recipe that I use for my soap for my piping as well. The only difference is that I leave it to thicken up and I stir occasionally until I reach a consistency that looks a little bit like this. It should hold on your spatula, just like so. It's really difficult to say how long it will take as it depends on different circumstances. Sometimes also your fragrance oil, but you just want to make sure that you keep an eye on it and you are ready to move quick and transfer your batter into a piping bag when it looks like this. Having your piping bag prepared that way makes your workflow really easy, even if you have to move fast because let's say your batter is thickening up quickly, or you have the complete opposite situation whereas your batter is still a little bit on the runny side. But even if you fill your bag, you know that it will not leak out and you can leave it a couple of minutes more to get to consistency. I like to use a piping bag that is big enough to hold my entire batter so I don't have to refill it in between, and therefore I like to use a spatula to get everything out of the jug. Giving your piping bag a shake or a tap down while you're filling it prevents air pockets from forming, and that's important if you want to have a continuous and smooth piping. Now let's have a look at the actual piping, and when you're ready you want to take your piping bag and squeeze the batter towards the front. You will guide it with one hand while you are gently squeezing from the top of your bag with the other hand. And I would advise you first start out by testing your consistency on a cookie sheet. The cookie sheet, by the way, is also a great place to practice your piping on in general. Let's have a look at different piping tips, starting with the closed star tip. That is a piping tip that creates deep grooves. What I like to do whenever I'm making soap cupcakes is to start with a dollop in the middle. You can clearly see how I squeeze the bag from the top. Starting with the dollop in the middle is actually a good trick because first of all you can test out your consistency, and if you think that is too runny you just wait a little longer. Also, it helps you support the frosting on top of it, and it also acts as a guide so you can pipe around it. So then I just circle one time around it, and this creates a nice rose design. You could leave it as is, it's very pretty, or you could decide to go and add an additional layer. Let's say you wanted to add an additional layer to what we already saw here. In that case, you guide your piping tip from the outside and you circle it towards the center. And when you are ready to lift your piping tip, you give it just an additional squeeze to give enough pressure so that you can lift your tip and you create this little dollop in the middle. Now let's have a closer look. Did you see how circling around and then adding the pressure just before you release your piping tip is going to create this nice dollop in the middle. Voila! The next tip is an open star tip. The jagged edges are straight here as opposed to the closed star tip. Also a very popular and very common piping tip. And here I have some cake slices where I just need to make one dollop, and I decided to go for a double squeeze. Very simple, just take one squeeze and then a smaller one on top. And you could leave it as is, or if you wanted to put on some decorations, then you can put some embeds in the middle of it. Just like so. Another technique that you could use with the very same piping tip if your batter is a little bit more on the loose side is this type of continuous piping trail that reminds me very much of an Italian ice cream cake. And here you apply the same trick that you give additional pressure to the piping bag whenever you want to lift or shift your piping tip. Here is another example of an open star tip piping, very similar to the one we saw just before, also across the soap loaf, with the difference that this consistency here is thicker, and you will notice a difference, whereas these ridges are more sharp and the edges are more crisp. So not only will your piping tip make a difference in your design, but so will also your consistency. Here is a mini muffin mold, and if you're making this type of baby cupcakes, then oftentimes a dollop in the middle is not really needed to support the frosting, and you can just go around as many times as you wish depending on how high you want to pipe, and then by circling it towards the center and again give it a squeeze before you release the tip will create a nice design. Our next tip is the French star tip, also a very popular one. I'm sure you have seen this before. It's an open star version, but it has many more jagged edges that are not so deep, so this will create a very unique design as well. Here you can see an example of me piping some soap cupcakes, and I start also with a dollop in the middle. This helps me support the piping as well as acts as a guide for the rest of my piping. And what you could do is to pipe one time around it to give it like a base. Notice how I squeeze the piping back here again and guide it with the other hand. Now I want to go back and I want to add some height to the cupcakes, and I do this by giving it a squeeze and then releasing the tip just slightly, but then adding another squeeze, a lighter one on top, and this will create this double dollop. Or let's say you have one base as we have seen before, and then you could go around from the outside towards the center and then end off again with this little tip in the middle by adding pressure to the bag and then lifting the tip. And of course, if you get really used to it, then you could add one or even two additional layers and make the piping really high. And then here we have again the situation with the baby cupcakes where you can see again this double squeeze but with the French tip. If you wanted to make a low piping, because maybe you want to add an important embed to your cupcake, then you could give it a single squeeze, as you can see here. And then here you can see another cake slice type soap with the French tip. I'm just giving it one squeeze, bigger one on the bottom and then a smaller one on top, and then you have this double dollop again. Also very cute and very easy as well. Then there is of course the round tip, is also a very commonly used tip. You have it in different sizes. Now if you wanted to start with piping, I wouldn't advise to use the round tip as your first tip to practice, let's say, because I find it is the most difficult to use and to control. In my experience, the bigger the piping tip is, the easier the piping will be. What concerns little decorations like you can see here on this gingerbread man soaps, of course the round tip is great. I like to wait a little longer than usual for this type of piping here for the consistency to be really thick. It gives a more defined look. The good thing about piping on soap that has already hardened, like when you come back for example the next day, is that if you make a mistake, you can just wipe off the soap and then just pipe on top again. And here you can see another round tip application. You can also make small dots with it by just squeezing and then letting go, as we have seen before. And then you have the so-called leaf tip that you would typically use if you would want to add some decorations to your piping or to your soap or to your cupcake, whatever it is. And how you use this tip is you hold it that way and then you squeeze and you gently pull away to create this end of the leaf, and then you let it fall onto your soap. This takes a little bit practice. You can also practice on a cookie sheet if you don't feel confident to pipe directly on your soap, and just continue until you have a feel for it. It looks more difficult than what it actually is, I promise. And here you can see an example of some bigger leaves. Then you have the so-called Russian piping tips, and this is a little bit different than the other piping tips, and I have found best is to wait until your batter is at a really very thick consistency, much thicker than usually, because you want these flowers to have a very precise definition, otherwise you won't see anything. I mean, you will see something, but you will definitely not see that it is a flower. Same thing applies if you wanted to use the piping as a filling of a donut, for example, as you can see here. You want to wait that the piping is really thick enough because you want it to support the soap that comes on top of it. Or for example here for this cake that has different tiers, you want it to be thick enough so that it holds and supports. Same applies for embeds. Let's say you wanted to add heavy embeds or a lot of embeds. Make sure your piping is strong enough and thick enough, as you can see here, and then it's very easy to add embeds in it and they will not fall off. Sometimes you will have situations where you are not piping vertically but more horizontally, and in this situation you also need your piping consistency to be a little bit thicker so it doesn't fall off the surface, so to speak. This piping tip here is a smaller one and it is an open star tip as well. Sometimes you have a situation where you want to pipe on melt and pour soap or melt and pour soap elements. As you can see here, I wanted to make some macarons and have a cold process soap piping in the middle. And what you want to do in this case is give it a good spritz with rubbing alcohol. This acts like a glue, and you wait for the piping to be firm enough so you can sandwich it. And if you remove your gloves, just make sure that you are careful you don't touch the fresh soap. If you want to pipe your whipped body butter, it's not a problem at all. Use your spatula to collect the piping batter inside your bag so you prevent air pockets, and then you basically just pipe along as you would with soap, except that this batter here is of course much lighter, but the same principle applies here as well. Same applies for sugar scrub. You just add it to your piping bag and then you pipe along, and this way you can make your sugar scrub look pretty inside your containers. If you like this video, remember to give it a thumbs up, and if you are interested in more soap making videos or tips, as well as skincare DIY, be sure to subscribe to my channel. See you very soon here for another video. In the meantime, I wish you a wonderful day. Bye bye!